Headlines. The investigation begins into the siege of a central Sydney cafe that ended with 2 hostages and the gunman dead. The hostage taker is described as a mentally unstable man infatuated with Islamic extremism. Korea's transportation ministry refers the Korean Air nut rage case to the prosecution as it's coming up with a penalty for the airliner. And China says there was no invite from North Korea for Wednesday's 3-year anniversary of former North Korean leader Kim Jong-il's death. Hello and welcome to ARIRANG News, coming to you live from Seoul. I am Kang Chae-ri. We begin in Australia with the aftermath of the Sydney hostage crisis that came to a violent end overnight, leaving 3 people dead, including the lone gunman. And for more, Paul E. is joining us from the news center. He's been following this story since it began yesterday. This siege, Paul, in the heart of the country's biggest city, lasted for some 16 hours. How are people coping there?
Well, many Australians are still coming to grips with this incredibly traumatic ordeal, while authorities are trying to piece together exactly what happened in those final fateful moments. A barrage of heavy gunfire was reported in the early hours of Tuesday as heavily armed officers stormed the Lindt Chocolate Cafe, shooting dead the gunman. Following the raid, New South Wales Police Commissioner Andrew Scipione said a total of 17 hostages were accounted for, including those who dramatically escaped earlier Monday. However, 2 civilians were caught in the crossfire during the operation. 34-year-old cafe manager Tori Johnson and 38-year-old mother of 3 Katrina Dawson were pronounced dead later at hospital. In a national address, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott expressed his condolences to the victims' families.
This has been an absolutely appalling and ugly incident. These were decent, good people who were going about their ordinary lives. It's about as innocent a thing as anyone can do, to go and grab a cup of coffee before the working day has fully started. Decent, innocent people who got caught up in the sick fantasy of a deeply disturbed individual.
So let's talk more about this deeply disturbed individual. What details have police have gathered so far or are disclosing on this individual?
Well, at the same press conference, Abbott described the hostage taker as a mentally unstable man who had a criminal record and was infatuated with Islamic extremism, but was not on a terror watch list. A police source named the gunman as Manharan Moniz, a 50-year-old refugee from Iran. Meanwhile, authorities are inspecting the crime scene for further clues and vowing to conduct a thorough investigation.
There are a lot of people for them to interview, and a lot of people are very tired at the moment. A lot of people are very emotional. We have to consider people's health and their welfare and their mental health at the moment. So this will take time for us to gather all the information so that we can piece together bit by bit exactly what happened.
They'll also have to answer how the gunman, a self-styled Muslim cleric, was allowed to walk into the chocolate cafe that fateful morning with a loaded weapon in a country with tough gun control measures. Back to you, Chae-ri.
Well, I'm sure this incident will continue to have far-reaching implications, and we will keep you posted on those as well. And that was our Paul E. on the latest on the Sydney hostage crisis. Thank you very much. And moving on to the next story of the day, Korea's transportation officials have confirmed that former Vice President of Korean Air, Cho Hyun-ah, more known now for her nut rage incident, did verbally abuse crew members during this incident. Korean Air is facing a 3-week suspension or millions of dollars in fines, while Ms. Cho will face criminal charges. Shin Se-min reports.
First came the international outrage. Now come the legal repercussions. The now former vice president of Korean Air, Cho Hyun-ah, is facing possible criminal charges, while Korean Air is looking at fines of up to $1.3 million and even a suspension of operations for 21 days. That's according to the Transport Ministry on Tuesday, which said aviation safety regulations were clearly violated when a Korea-bound flight returned to the gate to deboard the head of the cabin crew, all because a first-class passenger, Cho, was upset that her macadamia nuts were not served properly. Cho, who resigned from all duties at Korean Air last week over the scandal, has been called in for questioning by prosecutors on Wednesday. They plan to seek a warrant for her arrest on charges of violating aviation regulations. Jail time has not been ruled out. The headquarters of Korean Air have already been searched and cabin crew members and passengers questioned on the matter. At the same time, the Transportation Ministry will continue with its investigation. They're launching a special team that will review Korean Air's safety management system and determine whether the company's culture influenced the pilot's decision that day. Korean Air took out a written advertisement in major newspapers on Tuesday, saying the company was deeply sorry for the trouble it had caused. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
There have been signs here and there along the way that China and North Korea ties have been weakening, especially since the execution of Chang Song-taek last year. But come this Wednesday, it will be more evident as there will be no representative from China at a ceremony in honor of late leader Kim Jong-il. Our Connie Kim tells us more.
When North Korea marks the 3rd anniversary of former leader Kim Jong-il's death on Wednesday, they're likely to do so without a representative from China. Last year, the Chinese ambassador to North Korea, Liu Hongchai, appeared at a ceremony for the occasion. But a diplomatic source in Beijing says that won't be the case this year because Pyongyang did not extend an invite. Now that's representative of the frost that has developed on Sino-North Korea ties. There have been no high-level talks between Beijing and Pyongyang this year, and when Chinese President Xi Jinping visited the peninsula this past July, he didn't stop over in Pyongyang before coming to Seoul, as is a tradition for a Chinese leader. The two countries have been hoping to foster economic ties through the development of special economic zones, but those plans came to a screeching halt late last year with the execution of Chang Song-taek, who had been one of North Korea's most powerful figures and had close ties to Beijing. And in the 12 months since, China's crude oil exports to Pyongyang have been cut off completely, dropping from 578,000 tons last year to 0 this year. But there are some who predict relations will take a turn next year.
China is highly likely to side with North Korea when the UN Security Council discusses Pyongyang's human rights violations. This is when relations between the two countries will normalize.
Professor Yang expects high-level talks to take place at some point next year, by October at the latest, when North Korea marks the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
It's no surprise that South Korea is much better off financially, that is, than its northern neighbor, but by just how much? Statistics Korea says nearly 21 times better off. North Korea's gross national income per person stood at just under $1,300 last year, in stark contrast to the South's $26,000. Pyongyang's nominal GNI came to $31 billion, 43 times less than that of South Korea. And while North Korea's total trade volume did jump by $500 million to $7.3 billion last year, that's a mere fraction of the over $1 trillion South Korea recorded. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's win in this past weekend's snap election has some in Korea worried because of Abe's right-wing views and policies. Watchers say this could further strain Seoul-Tokyo ties. Lee Ji-yoon has this report.
Korea isn't planning on holding summit talks with Japan anytime soon. A government source in Seoul says Korea will continue, quote, normalized relations with Japan, but there will be no summit. President Park Geun-hye has made clear that she will not meet with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe unless Japan sincerely apologizes for its wartime atrocities. And with Abe's election win, many experts believe it's highly unlikely that he'll suddenly change his ultra-rightist political views. This means Abe is likely to keep on claiming the Korea-controlled Dokdo Island as Japan's territory. He's also likely to keep on denying that Japanese soldiers forced Korean women into sexual slavery during the Second World War. In fact, Abe reportedly plans to keep all his current cabinet ministers. One of those ministers is Eriko Yamatani. She wanted to remove a monument in New Jersey dedicated to the Korean women who were abducted by the Imperial Japanese Army. Some experts say, though, that Japan might try to change its diplomatic measures for the better. One reason could be the U.S., Japan's close ally. It's been prodding Tokyo to improve ties with Seoul because the U.S. wants to boost Washington-Seoul-Tokyo ties to counter the rise of China. For now, experts say unless Abe steps away from his nationalistic path, diplomacy will continue to be his Achilles heel. Lee Jun, ARIRANG News.
Korea's first Ebola aid medical staff team started training in England on Monday local time. Once they're done there, they will head to the most severely hit country of Sierra Leone. Kwon So-ah has more.
Korean medical personnel are getting ready to join the fight against the deadly Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone. 4 doctors and 6 nurses arrived in southeast England this week for 5 days of training that will prepare them for what they'll face on the ground in West Africa. The most crucial part of their training is learning how to put on the personal protective equipment correctly. Putting the gear on alone takes around 15 minutes. Britain has been among the countries leading the global response to Ebola, already sending hundreds of medical staff to West Africa. The care facility that the Korean group will be deployed to was set up by Britain.
Very much. The purpose of the training has a lot to do with maximizing the effectiveness of the medics who are going out as part of the response and making sure that the quality of care is high, but also safe for those who are providing it.
The Korean medical team is scheduled to fly to Sierra Leone this weekend and begin 1 month of caregiving at the end of December. More volunteers will be dispatched next year. While the epidemic has slowed in Guinea and Liberia, the number of patients in Sierra Leone continues to rise at an alarming rate. This is why health agencies say it's not only important to focus on treatment, but on preventing infection. The World Health Organization says new diagnostic tests may be available in the next few months, which could detect the virus in around 15 minutes. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
Plunging oil prices are wreaking havoc on the country economies, the troubled economies, that is, of Russia and Venezuela, sending shockwaves through their financial markets. The Russian central bank sharply increased its benchmark interest rate, but the emergency measures have done little to support the ruble. Our Kim Jong-il tells us more.
The Russian ruble is hovering at its all-time low despite a radical interest rate hike overnight. Falling oil prices and Western sanctions dragged the ruble to a low of 67 against the dollar on Monday. To arrest the fall, Russia's central bank hiked its key interest rate by whopping 6.5 percentage points to 17%. The Russian currency jumped against the dollar on Tuesday before being pushed back to near the Monday low. Concerns are rising for Russia as the ruble lost nearly half of its value against the US dollar so far this year, although the country has spent more than $70 billion to support its currency. There are no signs things will turn around for Russia, which rely heavily on oil for its revenues. Brent crude prices fell below $60 per barrel on Tuesday for the first time in 5 years. Worsening the prospect is fears that Washington considers new sanctions against Russia for Moscow's support for separatist militants in Ukraine.
The central bank is doing everything it can, but I think almost its hands are tied at the moment, and this is down to Putin to try and resolve the matter, something he just doesn't seem very willing to do.
Venezuela is seen to be worse off as oil makes up 96% of its export earnings. Many financial watchers warn that the Latin American country is pushed to the brink of default on its debt. Venezuela has the highest inflation rate in the region at more than 60%. Venezuelan benchmark sovereign bonds are now trading at just over a fifth of its face value. Kim Jong-il, ARIRANG News.
As opposed to Russia, though, the drop in crude oil prices is expected to bring some positive effects to the Korean economy. And according to an industry report, that effect will start to show in the second quarter of next year. A report by High Investment and Securities released on Tuesday says the country's manufacturing production will be among the first to feel a boost. The semiconductor, display, and auto industries will also benefit from the price fall, while the construction and food and beverage sectors will face a rather negative effect. Despite the government's rigorous drive here in Korea to encourage young entrepreneurs to begin startups, the proportion of those in the country has declined, and this is prompting concerns. Our Hwang Jie has the details.
The ratio of new startups run by entrepreneurs in their 20s and 30s is on the decline in Korea, while those started by the older generation is on the steady rise. Data from Statistics Korea shows the proportion of startups run by those under the age of 40 stood at 27% in the first 3 quarters of this year, down from 28.2% in 2013. New startups led by young entrepreneurs made up for more than 30% of the total in 2008 when the agency first started compiling related data. The ratio of new startups established by those in their 50s, on the other hand, has risen 5.2 percentage points over the past 6 years. The number of new startups led by Koreans in their 50s or older also jumped more than 15% in the January to September period this year from a year earlier, while the number of new startups led by those in their 20s and 30s rose a mere 4.7% during the same period. Experts say the trend is bad news for the economy. The rising ratio of new startups by the older generation shows younger entrepreneurs who usually want to take more risks and open more innovative, dynamic businesses are put off by government regulations. They also say Korea's young people may have lost some of their entrepreneurial spirit. Hwang Jie, ARIRANG News.
Koreans spend well over 3.5 hours, 219 minutes to be exact, a day using their smartphones, and that's excluding time receiving or making actual phone calls. The KT Economics and Management Research Laboratory says people in their 20s use their smartphones the most, especially during rush hour commutes and lunch breaks. Most of the time is spent on social network applications like Facebook and Twitter, or mobile shopping sites. A previous study back in 2012 said Koreans spent about an hour and a half a day peering into their smartphones. There are many ways to incorporate information and communications technology into our daily lives. The government is seeking to use to improve response and handling of disasters and boost productivity in the agricultural sector. Our Park Ji-won tells us more.
Korea's information and communications technology and scientific R&D abilities are among the best in the world, as proven by the nation's strong export items like smartphones and semiconductors. The government wants to foster the nation's strength in scientific areas to bolster 2 main sectors: disaster management systems and agriculture. The decision was reached at a presidential office meeting presided over by President Park Geun-hye on Tuesday, with over 100 experts in the field taking part. Korea has suffered a series of big disasters this year alone, like Sewol-ho ferry accident and a recent ventilation grate collapse in October that killed more than a dozen people. So the following steps are the government's strategies to apply ICT to disaster management. As for better prevention, the government will widely install safety sensors to diverse facilities like aged bridges and tunnels. And to swiftly respond to any disasters, intelligent CCTV surveillance systems will be used, which has artificial intelligence software that can recognize and analyze dangerous situations. To minimize damage from disasters, the government plans to focus on developing disaster management simulator programs and improving cutting-edge rescue facilities like rescue robot technologies. The government will also apply ICT to the nation's farming sectors to make them into higher value-added industries. Universities, businesses, and the government will work together on developing smart farm models by 2016, which will use diverse information technologies to improve agricultural productivity. R&D investments and education for nurturing technology-intensive agricultural venture projects are also one of the government's strategies to strengthen the nation's agricultural sector. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
And taking a look at other international stories making headlines today, authorities in Pakistan say at least 100 people have been killed in a deadly assault on a school by the Taliban. For more on this developing situation, we turn back to Paul Lee at the News Center. Paul, take us back to the very beginning. How did this attack start?
Well, on Tuesday morning local time, 5 or 6 suspected militants wearing security uniforms were seen entering the school located in the northern city of Peshawar. Soon after, sounds of gunfire and explosions were heard from inside the army-run school. Military troops have surrounded the complex, which held as many as 500 students and teachers at the time of the attack. This as scores of wounded are being transported to hospital. In a statement, the army said the majority of those inside had been evacuated, but that it was unclear how many were still being hostage.
We were sitting in the canteen. We saw 6 people climbing from the wall. We thought it must be the children playing some game, but then we saw a lot of firearms with them. They started firing at us, so we ran into the classrooms and closed the doors. They were entering into every room and beating the children and the staff members.
A Taliban spokesman has told the media that his group was responsible for the assault. He said that they had targeted the school in a personal retaliation for what he described as an attack by Pakistani army troops on their families.
And of course, we will be bringing you more updates on this deadly school attack as it unfolds. And moving on to the U.S. now, Paul, we bring you another shooting spree that broke out this time in the American city of Philadelphia. So police have launched a manhunt for Bradley William Stone, who is suspected of shooting dead 6 family members and wounding 3 others.
That's right. The 35-year-old Iraq war veteran is on the run from authorities and is believed to be armed and dangerous. This as police are warning residents in Montgomery County to lock themselves in case of additional attacks. The deadly shooting began at around 3:30 p.m. when Stone allegedly shot 4 members of his family, including his ex-wife, at their home, and shot 2 more of his ex-wife's relatives at their respective homes across 3 towns, including a 14-year-old girl.
The events of today actually began early in the morning at approximately 4:25 in the morning with a 911 hang-up call that was made calling police to Lansdale, to a home in Lansdale. Upon arrival, law enforcement found 2 deceased at that residence. The 2 women who were found in that residence were the former mother-in-law and the former grandmother-in-law.
Later, there was a reported case of a carjacking attempt by a man with a similar appearance as Stone, but there is no confirmation that he was the suspect. Police say Stone had also kidnapped his 2 young daughters from the scene of the killings, but they were later safely found with the neighbor.
And finally, a new report by the United Nations has shed further light on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, pushing the death toll to over 4,700. Give us the details.
Well, the latest figure as of December 12th includes government troops, enemy combatants, and also the civilians who have been caught in the middle of this prolonged violence over this last year. UN Assistant Secretary General Ivan Simonovich announced the fresh report on Monday during a news conference in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. He also raised concerns of the growing humanitarian crisis in the rebel-held east of the country.
The human rights in the eastern Ukraine remains grim. The violence and fighting, including indiscriminate attacks, have taken a heavy toll on the local population. This situation is aggravated by the inflow of heavy and sophisticated weaponry as well as foreign fighters, including some from the Russian Federation.
The UN has called on all sides of the conflict to return to the negotiating table in order to ensure that the fragile ceasefire holds. This as Western powers have blamed Moscow over the allegedly fermenting the violence with military supplies to the pro-Russian separatists. Charity?
All right, Paul, let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for those updates, and we'll see you again on Primetime News in just about 2 hours. And that will do it for this edition of ARIRANG News. Thanks for watching.